Attention, everybody. The views and opinions expressed on the show are not necessarily those of Acts Ministry, Acts Media Group, and/or their affiliate and supported ministries and or nonprofits. It's that time again. It's Friday, and it's the happy hour with your hosts, Dr. Paul Collins and his lovely wife, who puts up with him every single day. Bless her heart, Miss Nancy Collins. Take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning. It's 10 o'clock Central Standard Time, approximately 10. It's like 10:01 right now. We will be with you until approximately 10:55 Central Standard Time. I want to greet our folks who are so special to us, and then I'm going to get into something very serious. So all of you who are with us, stay with us, because today you're going to maybe hear some things you hadn't heard before that's very educational. Anyway, while everybody's settling in, let me say hello to Shirley, my first secretary in St. Joe, Missouri. Nancy, you know I'm very fond of St. Joe. It's a great little city. I moved there in 1959. I was there until 1964. And so I had 5 wonderful years in St. Joseph, Missouri, the town of the Pony Express, the way they carried the mail by horseback across this country for a little while. And it's the place where Jesse James was killed when he was shot in the back by a man named Bob Ford. And Jesse was living under an assumed name at the time because he was, obviously an outlaw on hiding out. He was living under the assumed name of Mr. Howard. So there was a song that was popular for years about Bob Ford, the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard and laid poor Jesse in his grave. But St. Joe is also very interesting because they call it a parkway system. When I lived there, we called it the boulevard system. And it runs from North St. Joe to South St. Joe. And it is a parkway. There's a stretch of it right through the middle of the city that there are a lot of houses, big old, beautiful homes. But for the most part, you can drive, and St. Joe's laid out mainly north to south along the Missouri River. You can drive all the way from North St. Joe to South St. Joe and be in a park. And it's beautiful. It's a beautiful drive. A lot of curves and hills, and there's some tunnels and one thing and another. It's just very nice. When I lived there, Quaker Oats was a big deal. That was the home of Quaker Oats. It was also the home of Stetson hats. Mm-hmm. And the packing houses were really big there. The meat packing companies, Armour and Company, Swift and Company, Dugdale. Sites moved in there just before I left. But St. Joe is a city with a lot of history and beautiful old homes, and yet a very progressive little city too. About 80,000 people approximately, give or take.
So it's not the size of Springfield?
About half.
Wow.
About half the size. Anyway, if you ever have an opportunity to visit St. Joseph, Missouri, in spite of the COVID-19, get out and go and spend a little time looking around a very historic Missouri city. It's a river town and very interesting. Back in the early 50s, there was a flood of the Missouri River, and it actually cut Rosecrans Airport away from St. Joe. St. Joe's Airport is Rosecrans Field. So now, since that time, since the 1950s, early 50s, you have to go over a bridge from St. Joe across the Missouri River and then another bridge back over to Rosecrans Field because it left it as an island, cut it away from Missouri. So you have to go out of Missouri into Kansas and then back over into Missouri. May not make sense to you. Look at a map. Anyway, very interesting place. In Texas, way down there around, is Judy around close to, what is it, College
Station?
College Station, which is close to Austin or someplace.
I think so.
Anyway, she's down that way, Judy Nickel. And then up in the Dallas Metroplex, I think up in the northeast of Dallas probably, is Galen Garrett. And then in Texas, way out there in the Panhandle, Lubbock, on what they call the Rock. See, Lubbock, you don't dig down very deep until you hit, well, capstone, they call it the cap, till you hit stone, because it's built, there's a little bit of soil on top of this huge rock, apparently. Anyway, Lubbock is a great little city, and Dr. Terry Gage, medical doctor, is a friend of ours. He practices there. And then we have a church there, Salvation Ministries, headed by Mark Elvers and his wife Deborah, and nice group of people. And Mark is a great little guy, been a real workman in the Lord's field a long time. And his wife Deborah is a very gifted piano player, keyboardist, and songwriter and singer. And then also out there, we have the very gifted Lyle Way. Lyle Way and his beautiful wife, Darlene. Lyle is a Christian novelist, and you need to go online, find some of his books. They are great, very imaginative, very creative. The one that's a favorite of Jim Whining, the president of Acts Ministry, is entitled Murder in Shades of Gray. And it's about old folks with gray hair who have a kind of a murder syndicate going. Quite a story. Who's going to suspect Granny of murder? Anyway, Lyle Way, bless your heart. You're a great storyteller, the greatest I've ever known. And Lyle is famous in our circle for the way he signs his emails and notes. He signs them Hugs and Slobbers. Get that, Hugs and Slobbers. So if you ever want to contact Lyle Way, get in touch with me, and I'll tell you how to get in touch with him, and you can sign your email, Hugs and Slobbers. Lyle will get a big kick out of that. Mm-hmm. Let's see. Also down in the Stephenville area, Lynette Parks, her husband, Harold Wayne, has been deceased now a couple of years, and Tom Shelton was a friend of ours down there. He's been gone 2, 3, 4 years, something like that, and the list goes on of more and more people who have gone to heaven in the last few years.
Well, when you go, everybody will be waiting for you.
That's right.
Including Jesus.
There's going to be a gang waiting for me
and your mom and dad and Jeff.
Yep, I've made a lot of friends along the way.
That's right.
And I've had a lot of relatives, and I'm of my generation the last man standing.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's see, who else do we have to talk about? Oh, my friend Jerry Chambers over in Chesterfield, Missouri. Now, Jerry is very special to me because he was a teenager in a church in St. Joseph when I was a pastor there, down South St. Joe, and I was the one who led him in his God and Country Award in the Boy Scouts. Oh, speaking of Boy Scouts, here's a little history for you. Now, you see, some of you are going to begin to hang on to my words now, because later we're going to talk about some very interesting stuff. But this is interesting. Many of you know about the Boy Scouts, and you know about the Order of the Arrow of the Boy Scouts. Did you know that the Order of the Arrow was preceded by a group that's still in existence, as far as I know, that was started by the Scout Executive in the St. Joseph District, and it was called the Tribe of Mickosay, M-I-C-O-S-A-Y, the Tribe of Mickosay. And I was initiated into the Tribe of Mickosay when I was a pastor there, and they gave me my Indian name, Warrior Truth Speaker. So that was mine, and our salute was like this. When you walked through the totem poles, you saluted. And that Scout executive's name was Roe, R-O-E, Roe Bartle, B-A-R-T-E-L. Oh. He moved to Kansas City to be the Scout executive there, and based on the organization that he had conceived, called Mickosay, he put together the Order of the Arrow. The Order of the Arrow, and he was the chief. So therefore, in Kansas City to this day, you have Bartle Hall, that's Municipal Auditorium. You have Arrowhead Stadium, and you have the Kansas City Chiefs, all because of Roe Bartle, who started in St. Joseph as a scout executive. By the way, Roe Bartle not only became scout executive of Kansas City, but obviously he also became the mayor of Kansas City. So there you have it. St. Joe comes to the surface again, and a major player in something really big like the Kansas City Chiefs and Arrowhead Stadium, etc. Now then, Nancy, we also have friends up in northeast Missouri that we need to at least pay a little bit of attention to. They don't expect it, but they'll get it. Janie Wood. Janie's been a widow now about 4 years, coming up there. Jim Wood was a good friend of ours, and Janie, good friend, and they pastored a little church there called Ministry in Action. And until recently, Janie carried on, but I think I've heard now that she finally shut the church down, and the folks found other places to be. North and a little east of her is a little church, Lakeview, and it sits on a corner out in the middle of nowhere with a big cemetery, or a small cemetery next to it, and the pastor there is Lynn Purdy, and Lynn calls me usually about once a month on a Friday night, and we have a nice long chat. And we know those folks at Lakeview. We've been there many times, I would say, and had services and a great dinner. In fact, I was called on to fulfill a promise because Lynn's mother, who was getting on up in years, liked me, and she asked me if I would preach her funeral. And I agreed. I said, sure, Miss Purdy. You know how you make these statements, and I was serious. Yeah, I would do it. But, you're going to live a long time. Well, she did live a long time, and she never forgot that I was to preach her funeral. And she reminded her son, and she passed away, and her son called, reminded me. He said, you promised my mom that you would preach her funeral. So we went way up into northeast Missouri, and we're at the visitation for her. A lot of people. For a woman her age, she had lots of friends in a very small town. And then a big crowd at her funeral. I preached the funeral. Then we went to another little town, to a Baptist church that provided lunch. Remember that? Mm-hmm. Wow. You could get in trouble eating like that every day. That's for sure. Anyway, now, Nancy, today, with our reminiscing out of the way, I'm going to talk a little bit about the philosophy of medicine. For instance, some folks now don't realize any difference here, like in our cosmopolitan area, between MD degrees, medical doctor, MD, and DO, doctors of osteopathy. Doctor of osteopathy is a DO. They practice together. They do the same things, basically, and yet one is a graduate, we'll say, of, like our guest last week, Dr. Jamie Durfee, graduate of the School of Medicine at University of Missouri at Kansas City. So hers is an MD degree. Our dermatologist, who's a specialist, is a DO, Doctor of Osteopathy degree, and so it's sort of like my old story about General Eisenhower and Prime Minister Churchill during World War II. Eisenhower, who was called Ike, and Winston Churchill, who was called Winnie. Ike says to Winnie, why do I say schedule and you say schedule? And Winnie replied, Ike, it's very simple. It's because we went to different shuls. So that's the difference in these degrees now. However, there is a difference in philosophy. I didn't look up the history of the MD degree. It goes way back, obviously, to the time when, as we talked with Dr. Durfee last week, when on the frontier you studied medicine with a practicing doctor, and after a while you just started practicing. There was no degree involved. It was all you practiced. So they still talk about practicing medicine. But I did look up the history of the degree of Doctor of Osteopathy. And by the way, wouldn't it be great if we had Christians who practiced being Christian? Just like doctors are still practicing medicine years after being in school. If we had Christians who practiced Christianity, that's another topic. Anyway, Doctors of Osteopathy started in 1895.
Wow.
Because there was a man who believed that there were nerves in the physical body that could be affected by the skeletal structure. So he made it a point that you had to treat the whole person. It was a philosophy of how to approach people with their medical needs. And it did involve some adjusting of the back and the hips. It involved freeing up nerves to, like, if you had if you were having stomach issues, there were nerves connected to that and so forth. However, prior to that even, or thereabouts the same time, the philosophy of chiropractic came in. And there was a man named Palmer. By the way, osteopathy was a man, John Allen Still, I believe is his complete name, who founded the School of Osteopathy and the science of osteopathy and formalized it. And in fact, I had an office in north central Missouri years ago where the man had an office who started his name was Dr. Harry Still, who started osteopathy at the school in Kirksville, Missouri, the College of Osteopathic Medicine, Osteopathy and Surgery. Anyway, the man named Palmer who had this idea, what happened was he had somebody working for him who leaned over to pick up something and couldn't get back up. And he was also lost his hearing. He was deaf. And Palmer got him on the floor on his stomach because he saw something protruding from his back, and he put that back in place. And the man stood up and he could hear. So this Palmer founded the science of chiropractic, where the spine gets adjusted in order to alleviate pain and to free up nerves that go to different parts of the body. Chiropractic is a big thing now. Springfield, Missouri has a lot of people who practice chiropractic medicine. Now, what about podiatrists? They have a degree in podiatry, a doctor's degree in podiatry, and all they work with are the lower extremities, like from the knee down, especially the foot. And there are more bones in the human foot than in any other part of the body. And medical doctors, if you have a foot problem, they usually refer you to a podiatrist who is not an MD. It's a specialty that now stands on its own. They have 4 years of college, then they go to 4 years of podiatry school, and they get a degree in medicine of podiatry. And it's a relatively newer science degree. Probably came along, I'm trying to remember the dates now, I think as a separate discipline in medicine, probably in the late 1900s. Now, we also have developed, medically speaking, doctors of audiology. In fact, I have a hearing doctor that was the source of my hearing assisting devices, my hearing aids. His practice is, he has a doctorate in audiology. 4 years of college in preparation, and then 4 years of studying the science of audiology, everything about the ear. In fact, our one of our audiologists quite regularly is in the surgical suite when someone, an MD surgeon, is working on doing surgery on an ear. He may very well be there. Anyway, that became a formalized degree in the very late 1990s and early 2000s. And so we still have many, many people who are fitting hearing aids, testing hearing and so forth, who are technicians. They are not doctors of audiology. Doctors of audiology are still a little scarce, but they're beginning to turn them out of our local university here, our local state university, with frequency. So it's a growing science. So Nancy, behind all of these medical things that I've mentioned, which, by the way, when we have Dr. Durfee back with us in the future, we're going to visit with her about these various degrees. There's a philosophy involved, a philosophy of medicine. That gets me then to this idea that maybe it's time, we'll find out, for us to use some of the happy hour to bring to people's attention philosophy. Because we have the philosophy of medicine, we can have the philosophy of religion, we can have the philosophy of life, almost anything. And I used to tell my philosophy students at the college when I was teaching, all it takes to be a philosopher is a sense of wonder. Just say, I wonder about that. You're on your way to pursuing philosophy. Now, to have something more specific to deal with today about philosophy, we will deal a little bit about philosophy of religion. Now, if any of you want additional information on any of this, all you have to do is send me an email, drpaulcollins@sbcglobal.net, or you can reach me through the Acts Ministry website, actsmediagroup.com. That's Acts, A-C-T-S, mediagroup.com, and so forth. There's a way that you can reach me. They'll help you. All the information is there. And but philosophy of religion, really, the basic thing is philosophy concerning God. So there are various philosophical statements. We could say arguments, but that people sometimes think if you have an argument, there's anger. No, it's a discussion, consideration. So the various philosophical arguments for God.
Is that why there's so many denominations?
We'll get to that. That follows. One of the arguments for the existence of God is called the cosmological. It's an extension of the word cosmos, and we think of the cosmos as the universe way out there. The cosmological argument says something cannot come from nothing. There has to be a first cause. Everything has a first cause. And they use an illustration like lining up dominoes. Remember, and you touch one and then they all fall down. Anyway, a first cause. That's called the cosmological argument. There had to be, if you find out what caused a car, what caused the parts of the car, what caused the metal, where did the metal come from? You get down to where it comes out of the earth. Well, what caused the earth? Had to be a first cause. Cosmological argument. Take notes. And if you don't get a chance to take notes, be in touch with me through the Acts Media Group website. They will forward it on to my email, drpaulcollins@sbcglobal.net. I'll be happy to provide you with some notes via email. The cosmological argument. Then there's what's called the teleological argument for the existence of God. Teleo is easily remembered, I think, because it almost sounds like technical. Teleological means that there are such details in the universe that it couldn't be by accident. They compare it to the inner workings of a clock, a wind-up clock. If anyone has ever seen the inside of an old wind-up clock, not these digital things, that we have around, but regular old wind-up clock, take it apart and look inside, you'll see that there are all kinds of wheels and cogs and springs, small pieces. I had an uncle many years ago that aspired to be a watchmaker. And he studied and studied and studied, and he had the tools. And to be a watchmaker in those days was a very delicate thing. Now, most of the time, because people used to have their watches repaired. Now, they're disposable. You buy one, they're cheap, you wear it a while and throw it away or whatever. This is a cheap one I've had for about 30 years. Still doing this job, so I still have it. Anyway, the teleological argument says there's such detail, such intricacy involved in everything connecting all the time to make the universe work, that there had to be a designer. So it's called the design theory, the design philosophy, teleological argument for the existence of God. When you have the evidence of design, there has to be a designer, an architect, so forth. Then there's the ontological argument for the existence of God. This one's very difficult to grasp, but ontos is a Greek word that basically is translated being, B-E-I-N-G, being. And the ontological argument for the existence of God is something that I have studied from top to bottom, side to side, inside and out, and it's a difficult philosophy because, see if I can take my own confusion about it and bring it down into workable terms. You presume the existence of God.
Oh, that's neat. Presume.
Mm-hmm.
That's an important word.
And you presume the existence of God as a superior, perfect being because you presume that you are a being. So if you are a being, you presume there's another being, bigger, greater, perfect, outside of you.
Is that like the chicken and the egg?
Right, which comes first. Now, this has given a spin-off to a philosophy called the existentialism procedures. Existentialism, you take the word exist and extend it out. And they say that there has to be essence before existence.
So what's essence?
Essence would be we were in the mind of God before we were ever created. He knew us before we were in our mother's womb. That theology comes out of this existential philosophy concerning essence precedes existence.
So a person could have a thought, and that thought could come into reality because of the things that he sees around him that would help him bring that idea to something that's
Sure.
you can touch.
It's
feel.
like if you put together a new dish for dinner meal, you have an idea about, I don't have a recipe for that, but let me see what I can do. And
Yeah.
you begin to play with things. You have the thought and the essence of it up here, so real that you can kind of taste the flavors before they come together. And then you begin to put them together and you make the dish, and all of a sudden you have a new dish and you've created a recipe. But the essence preceded existence.
Yeah, that's like looking through that recipe book this morning.
That's right.
And I was seeing all the recipes that take tomatoes. Well, you're after 85 years, you're allergic to tomatoes.
Yeah, it's never too late to get a new allergy, folks.
No, so I thought, oh, thank you, Jesus. How about vegetable broth? So I'm going to try some of those with vegetable broth instead of tomatoes.
That's right. In fact, you see, you can have dishes that call for eggs, and if you do not eat eggs or if you're allergic to them, some people who are pure vegan will not eat eat anything with a mother or a face or any of their products. Therefore, you wouldn't eat eggs. They have something called egg replacement that will do the same thing with a vegetarian-based thing, plant-based, I should say, that eggs will do. So anyway, essence precedes existence.
Or you can use applesauce instead of butter.
That's right. Essence before existence. Now, so I've covered cosmological, the cosmos, first cause, teleological, meaning design.
That's so awesome.
Design requires a designer. Now, ontological, ontos meaning being. So since I'm a being, it presupposes there must be a being greater than I am, and therefore, to be ultimate being, he must be perfect. Therefore, that's God. Now, and then existentialism, which essence before existence. Now we have all this in place. Now we have all this in place, and we come to philosophy as far as we Westerners are concerned, not Middle Eastern and not Eastern. Eastern would be like India and China. Middle East would be the Arabs, and even the Lebanese are not Arab, and the Iranians are not Arab, and so forth. But that part of the world, the Middle Eastern, we are Western in our philosophy orientation for the most part. So that originated in Greece, the little nation of Greece. And we had what were called the ancient philosophers. Greece had been operating based on something that many people studied in school called mythology, myth. They had a system of gods and goddesses that were superhuman. And in one event, the head god happened to have had relations with a mortal woman and produced a god man, or a man god, called Hercules. And they made TV series about that and about Hercules and so forth. But anyway, for the most part, mythology ruled the Western world through Greece. In the Romans also operated with mythology. However, they put their emperor as a god above all other gods. But the Greeks, up until about 500 BC, they were big on mythology. They had man and woman who were a god and goddess, who were the head god and head goddess living on a mountain called Olympia. And that's why people didn't see them, because they were always up on that mountain. Studying mythology is an interesting thing to do, by the way, because you had not only Zeus and his wife. In Roman mythology, that was Jupiter, and we have a planet named Jupiter. Jupiter and Juno, his wife. But in Greek mythology, Zeus and his wife had one child who became a goddess, and one name was Diana. Another name for her was Ceres, Ceres. Diana was the goddess of the hunt, because people hunted for part of their sustenance, their living, but they also raised crops, and so she also was the goddess of the harvest. And when she was the goddess of the hunt, they called her Diana. When she was the goddess of the harvest, they called her Ceres, Ceres, from which we get the word cereal, the grain. All right. So anyway, all of that was pervasive until some philosopher named Thebes visited Egypt and the Nile River. and the Nile River flooded, as it does regularly, makes the Nile Valley very rich agriculturally. When the floodwater went down, he saw a frog coming up out of the mud. And he said, "Oh, now I get it. We're not the offspring of a god and goddess that we've never seen up there on Mount Olympus, but instead, we originated out of water. Life comes out of water." You realize, of course, that that's still true.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, even when we're given birth, it's a watery birth, etc. And that won't get into that. But he was called a natural philosopher. He was followed by some others who observed life. There was one, Democritus, I think was his name, I like very much. He said, nobody can step in the same river twice, because when you step in, you step out. If you step back in, that water's gone, because water flows. He said, life is like that. It moves, it flows. You can't relive yesterday. Yesterday's gone. There's songs about that. And tomorrow has not yet come. Yesterday's gone, tomorrow hasn't come. Life flows, changes. And then there was one who said the reason we can see is because everything puts off little particles and they hit our eyes, and our eyes interpret, that makes a picture, and so forth. So they went through all of these until, and there were many others, until one day in Athens, the capital of Greece, in the marketplace, that's where, like the town square where people would go to talk and discuss and so forth, do politics, etc. They had wandering teachers in Greece called sophists. They just went from place to place, and they usually developed a little following, sort of like many years later, Jesus and his followers. And at the same time, in the Old Testament, you had a prophet who would have a group following him called the School of Prophets. These were sophists. And from that we get the name Sophie. We get sophisticated. We get sophistry. We get all kinds of words from it. Sophomore.
And what about soffits on a house?
No, it's spelled different.
Oh, it's spelled different.
That's Soffifits, and sophist, Sophist.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, one came into town and decided to stay. He developed quite a following. And Socrates was his name. And a lot of young people started listening to him. And after a while, he got in trouble with the Greek authorities because they felt like he was leading the youth astray. He was corrupting the youth. So they brought him to trial. The jury had like 439 people on the jury. It's like mob rule almost. And condemned him to death. And he was given a choice of how to die. And one choice was to drink a cup of poison called hemlock. And he drank the cup of poison and died. But he'd had quite an influence. One of his students took over, basically, the school and developed it further. His name was Plato. Plato was responsible for some things that we're experiencing in the United States today. In fact, there's a book out, From Plato to Socialism. Because the philosophy of Plato provided some of the basic ideas that gave Karl Marx ideas, and Marx was influenced by Friedrich Engels, and he got his ideas from Plato, and so forth. That's another whole study. But this stuff goes way back, and if you don't understand where you came from, it's hard to know where you are, and you certainly can't tell where you're going.
No, and you can't, oh, thank you, Jesus, and you don't understand the reason why things are turning out the way they are.
Sure. You wonder, why is this going on? Now, if you want to get up to date on some of this, you can go online and buy a book called Live Not the Lie. Live Not the Lie by Rod, R-O-D, Dreher, D-R-E-H-E-R, Rod Dreher. Live Not the Lie. Very well done book about how socialism and communism can arrive on the scene. It sort of slips up on you, and next thing you know, you're under its rule. Yesterday, Nancy, you and I had the privilege of having, we had some guests in our home. One was there and set up, Tony Hammock, who's the gold standard man on Axe Media Group, has a great show here on Axe Media Group. Tony is a man who understands finances and precious metals, and he did a presentation for us, and Billy Burris, who's a tried to retire minister, who's still at it because people just won't let him retire. Billy Burris is a great guy, but we had a good time looking at a program involving precious metals, especially silver and gold, and very educational. And then when that was wrapping up, then we had a local, very well-known political figure who came with a lady who was in Poland. She is a Polish lady. She was there when Solidarity came to power, and her husband was a part of the Solidarity movement, one of the leaders of it. And Solidarity, for those who haven't read up on your history, was a group of trade unions that got together and became Solidarity, and they toppled the communist government in Poland. And so we listened to her story, which, by the way, she's going to write a book, and I'll be publishing her book for her, of her experiences before, during, and after communism in Poland. And her husband and her four children live here in this country. Only one of them lives in Springfield, but marvelous lady, great story. Anyway, when they both became acquainted then through us with Rod Dreher's book, which is called Live Not the Lies. And so we come back then to Plato, from Plato to socialism. Plato also contributed to Christianity because he's the philosopher who had the idea that life is divided into two separate entities or distinctions, we could say. The real world that we see, like this table, this microphone in the arm, and people, things that are visible, and the invisible world you do not see. And Plato taught that the real world is the world you don't see, because in the real world, nothing changes. It all stays the same. Everything, and that's essence before existence, everything that exists has already existed in the invisible world, so there's really nothing new except it's new to this world. For instance, these microphones pre-existed in the invisible world before they were manifest in the world that we can see. From that, because the Apostle Paul, early Christian evangelist, missionary, who happened to be of the Jewish faith, he was a Pharisee, he grew up in Greece, and he knew Greek philosophy. However, he was trained by Gamaliel, who was the most outstanding Hebrew scholar of his day, and he became a trained Pharisee, left Greece and went to what is now Israel, or the Holy Land, and we know about his career. That's another story. But he was an interesting guy in that he's the one who really, of all of the writers in the New Testament, made a big deal. He was, well, he's not the only one, but he was one of three in the New Testament who made a big deal out of an invisible world. And I really believe they got their ideas primarily from Paul. Now, Jesus had an idea about heaven and paradise and so forth, but Paul really picked up on that because when he lived in Greece, he was Saul, and he lived in Tarsus. They called him Saul of Tarsus. So anyway, Plato influenced, and his philosophy influenced the Apostle Paul hundreds of years later, because Plato lived in the 400s BC. Paul is living in 100 AD, like 500 years later. Let's see, where can I take you with this? Eventually, another guy who had a real interest in philosophy through Plato was named Aristotle. He was from Macedonia. And when he couldn't take charge of the school, he kind of got his nose out of joint. He went home to Macedonia and became the teacher for Alexander the Great,
Wow.
who conquered most of the known world before he was 33 years old. He died when he was about 33. Died of syphilis, by the way. And but he was the reason that Alexander liked Greek culture. As a Macedonian, he loved the Greek culture. So he spread the Greek culture over most of the known world, and that Greek culture was known as Hellenism. And so we had the Hellenistic period when Greek philosophy, Greek ideas were out over most of the known world. So then we see the influence there of philosophy. Then years later in the 400s, 400, maybe later than that, after Aristotle, there was a philosopher who was born in Egypt, but he was Greek. His name was Plotinus. And he really took up with Plato again. He loved the writings of Plato. And see if I can get this right. He talked about us being being, intellect, and soul.
Oh.
3 parts. Guess what?
Uh-huh.
Today, Christian theologians, for the most part, say that we are a tripartite being. 3 parts: body, mind, and soul. Mm-hmm. He called it being, intellect, and soul. So Plotinus had an effect, and he was a Greek philosopher. All of this before Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, here's something, folks, you may find very interesting. While all of this is going on in Greece, 1,500 years earlier, in the Middle East, there was a man whose name was Abram, who later became Abraham. About 1,500 years before Socrates got rid of mythology, in a sense, him and the natural philosophers before him, here's a man named Abram, and God speaks to him and tells him to take Sarai, his wife, and go. I'm going to take you into a land you've never seen. And faith was born, because we know from a study of faith that it began with Abraham. Abraham had faith to follow God, going someplace he didn't know where he was going, but he would know when he got there that he was there. And that was happening 1,500 years before Greek philosophy. That so much of what we do today is based on Greek philosophy. And part of it influences our politics, from Plato to socialism. Part of it influences Christianity, because it's from Plato to the Apostle Paul, etc. So we live in a philosophical and a theological world, and in the few seconds I have remaining, here's the deal. Theology is still the queen of the sciences. Mm-hmm. Nothing else makes sense without theology. And theology produced What did you say,
I
Matt?
said that makes sense.
And theology was the reason why philosophy got noticed. So anybody that wants to learn more about philosophy and theology, how it ties into the Bible, history, and politics, check out axmediagroup.com and let them know, and they will get you in touch with me, and I will put you in touch with a storehouse of knowledge. Matthew, we've had a good time today. Hope you've had a good time. And so until next Friday, this is old Dr. Paul along with sweet little Miss Nancy
Oh, that's right.
saying, whatever you do, stay blessed.